Hi, I'm Katherine Schwab. I'm an assistant managing editor here at Forbes covering tech, and I'm so excited to be here today to talk about data centers in space. Everyone is talking about this right now. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Google, and I'm so excited to be here with Philip Johnston. He's the CEO and co-founder of Starcloud, an NVIDIA-backed startup that just launched the first GPUs to train AI models in space. Philip, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Philip, let's start with the most obvious question. Why should we be building data centers in space? What's your vision for how this is better than building data centers on Earth?
Yeah, it's definitely the right place to start. So the reason we're building data centers in space is because we're very quickly running up against energy constraints on Earth. And in space, we have access to almost unlimited low-cost energy in the form of solar. So, if you want to build a new 100 megawatt or gigawatt scale data center on Earth, first you need to build a new 100 megawatt energy project on Earth. And the lead time on permitting for that can be, decades. Whereas in space, we can launch these things very quickly and be up and running instead of in, years and decades. Within weeks and months, we can be up and running.
Okay, but it must be so much more expensive to actually do
Well,
this.
right now it's more expensive. We have a bunch of new launch vehicles coming online, which will lower the cost of launch very significantly. And so over time, we actually expect the all-in energy cost of doing it in space to be 10 times at least cheaper than doing it on Earth. So rather than for a new energy project on Earth, you might be looking at between 5 and 10 cents per kilowatt hour. In space, we're looking at less than half a cent per kilowatt hour, including the launch cost, once we have these launch vehicles like Starship online.
Okay, so don't you need, though, really like massive solar panel installations to be able to make this work? I mean, that's what the International Space Station uses. So can you explain
Yeah,
what the satellites you're building look like and how they will possibly generate as much energy as you're talking about?
yeah, for sure. So on the front page of our website, starcloud.com, people can see an animation of what a 5 gigawatt data center in space might look like. And that has a 4 kilometer by 4 kilometer solar panel with a 1 kilometer by 4 kilometer radiator down the back there. And since you mentioned the ISS, I think it's probably a helpful comparison. The International Space Station, you could launch the entire International Space Station with 2 Starship launches. Now, Starship they will be producing 3 Starships per day. Each one can potentially fly multiple times per day. Um, and the capacity builds on itself. So we could be seeing, hundreds of Starship launches per week within a few years. And so, yeah, I mean, the ISS is going to be considered very cute by by the standards of 5 years' time.
Cute.
Yes.
Okay. And of course, when you're talking about Starship, you're talking about Elon Musk's much, much bigger rocket that he has been testing at
Yeah.
SpaceX.
Yeah.
Um, can you talk a little bit more about how Starship represents this kind of paradigm shift for what
Yeah.
we're able to do in space?
Yeah, for sure. So Starship, for those that don't know, it's this absolutely massive rocket that SpaceX are building down in South Texas. It is the first ever fully reusable rocket, and that's extremely significant because right now, when you launch a rocket, you have to rebuild the whole upper stage every time. That's like 10 or $15 million just thrown down the drain every time you do a launch. It would be a bit like if you fly from London to New York and you had to rebuild the plane when you landed to get back. That's literally how the space industry operates right now. With Starship, it's reusable, and so that means you can just continuously fly it, a bit like flying an airplane. And so it literally lowers the cost of launch by between 50 and 100 times the current price. So with Falcon 9, the current launch vehicle that most mass is put into space with this launch vehicle, it's currently around $6,500 a kilo. The marginal launch cost with Starship is $10 to $20 a kilo. So the additional cost per launch for SpaceX is much cheaper, like at least 100 times cheaper. Um, the customer price might be like $50 to $100 in the end state. That's what they said they're targeting. But we're break even at around $500 a kilo, so well within range of the Starship prices.
Okay, so these solar panels that you're talking about, which are really core to making this entire idea work, you said
Yeah.
those are 4 kilometers by 4 kilometers.
If you
How
were to, yeah,
is that?
go
Did
on.
those are those kind of folded up and
Yeah.
then they expand? What happens if they break? Like, I mean, there are so many pieces of this idea that I think are hard to understand, like practically how this makes sense. So I'm curious, um, like where you're at in the engineering stages for actually building this satellite,
Yeah.
and how you're thinking through those practical problems.
Yeah, for sure. So just for those who aren't aware, we've just launched our first spacecraft. It has the first NVIDIA H100 on board. It's about 100 times more powerful GPU compute than it's been in space before. And the purpose of that one was to prove that we can dissipate the heat from these powerful chips and that we can operate them in a high radiation environment. So we've proved that a significant portion of the technology already, although that's a much smaller version. For the large 4 kilometers solar panel, to be honest, it's very unlikely we would need to dock together a data center that large until you probably at least 10 years before you need to dock something like that together. And the reason is the only reason you need to dock it together is if you want to train a large model in space. And so you need the whole thing to be internally networked, very high capacity internal networking. For most tasks, you don't need that. So for almost all inference tasks, which is like when you type into ChatGPT and it comes back with a response, you don't need to internally network a data center. So for that, we will just launch every time we launch, we'll launch one full Starship payload bay. That's about 150 tons. It's 20 to 30 megawatts per launch, and that will contain its own solar panels and radiators on board. So yeah, you're talking about football field sizes rather than kilometer sizes of solar panels and radiators. And for that, yeah, you have these very thin film solar panels that you can roll up and unroll.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, let's talk about the cooling piece of this, because data centers on Earth right now, of course, use tons and tons of water to keep these chips cool because they're dissipating so much heat. There are no fans in space. There's no water in space. Can you explain the physics of why you need to radiate it and how that works?
Yeah, for sure. No, that's a great question. So as you mentioned, in space we don't have convection or conduction because we don't have any medium through which to transport the heat away from the chips. And so the only cooling technique we can use in space is radiative cooling in infrared radiation. So all things that are warm kind of glow in infrared. If you had an infrared camera on your face, you would see that your face is glowing continuously in infrared. And it's the same for things in space. But what you need is a large surface area. And so the way we do this is we run coolant past the chips. It's a fluid, and then that runs out to these very large radiators through channels, and it keeps the radiators at around 50 degrees C. Now, the background temperature of space is about minus 270 degrees C, so there's a very big gradient in different temperature gradient. And so what that does is it emits in infrared at about 800 watts per square meter, the waste heat. Now, the solar panels only generate 200 watts per square meter. And so what that means is you need about 4 times the surface area in solar panel than you have in radiator. So if you were to have 1 square kilometer of radiator, that would be 4 square kilometers of solar panel, that you would be dissipating the heat from.
So it sounds like there are a lot of engineering challenges here to kind of get to this much larger scale that you're talking about versus kind of the smaller chunks.
Well, I'll call them manufacturing challenges. So the International Space
Okay.
Station has these large radiators right now, which dissipate about 70 kilowatts, which is for the next generation about the size we're looking at. So we know it's doable. It's not really a physics or there's not too much hardcore R&D that needs to happen on the physics side. The problem with the ISS radiators is that they are expensive and heavy. So our challenge is to make them cheaper and light. And that is more of a sort of manufacturing problem than it is anything else. And so we have some very innovative manufacturing techniques. On our second spacecraft launching next year, it has 100 times the power generation of the first. Our radiator has 10 times lower mass per watt of dissipation than the International Space Station radiator, and 100 times lower cost per watt of dissipation than the International space station radiator. So it's
Okay.
all things are solvable in this regard.
Okay. So underlying all of this is the demand for more data centers.
Yes.
Of course, there's also kind of talk and fear about if that demand is going to be founded. Like if, all of these massive projects going up right now, is that demand really going to be there to support the scale of the build out that is happening right now? Seems like you're really betting that not only is the demand going to hit the levels that we're seeing right now in terms of what's being plotted out on Earth, but that we are going to need so much compute that we need to go into orbit. So help me, help me understand a little bit more about kind of those bigger assumptions that you have that are kind of at the core of the company.
Yeah, for sure. So actually, my expectation is that within 10 years, most new data centers will be being built in space purely because of the constraints we face on energy terrestrially. So I would reframe it slightly. It's not like we think there's going to be tons of demand on Earth, and additionally, we need all of this demand in space. It's more like there's tons of demand. It's actually a lot cheaper to do it in space than it is to do it on Earth. And so we will do it in space rather than doing it on Earth. Yeah, I wouldn't say we have a different forecast than most people in terms of the projected demand for AI compute. It's just that we can see that it will be cheaper to do it in space than it will be to do it on Earth. So if you're going to build data centers anywhere in 10 years' time, and I presume they're not going to completely stop building data centers in 10 years' time, then the cheapest place to do it will be in space purely because of the energy.
Okay, so where do you think that tipping point is? It's 10 years out, or is that purely on a cost basis, or what's that 10-year horizon?
The 10 years is my forecast for when more than half of new data centers will be being built in space.
Okay.
In 5 years' time, it will be cheaper, but there will still be lots of people building data centers on Earth. So once we have Starship being produced at rate, which is coming in about 2 years' time, so they're building these two massive Starship gigafactories, one in Texas, one in Florida, designed to produce 3 Starships a day. Once we have rate manufacturing of Starship, that's when the cost curve switches and it becomes cheaper to do it in space. It still takes a long time to ramp up production, and that's why it will still be a while before we are, stop building data centers in space.
So my understanding as well is that AI chips are very sensitive and space is very harsh. Can you explain a little bit about how you're solving that piece of the problem here?
Yeah, for sure. So with our first spacecraft, we have this H100 on board, which is considered sort of the most, well, at least when we launched it, was considered the most powerful AI chip that you could, the people, everybody fights over this chip essentially. So we have been testing that in various radiation environments on the ground in order to inform our choice of shielding and software for mitigation of radiation effects. So we went through 2 rounds of testing in the cyclotron, which is like a proton beam accelerator down in Knoxville. And then we went through 1 round of testing in the high velocity heavy ion beam testing, a particle accelerator down in Brookhaven National Lab. And the results from that, I think we're now the only people in the world that know where an H100 will fail if you blast it with high velocity protons and heavy ions. And what that means is we then use those findings to determine our choice of shielding and also our choice of software to mitigate bit flips.
What you just said brings up another challenge. There are really a number of challenges here that you're facing. The fact that these chips get better and better every year, and by the time you've sent something into space, it's not easy to like swap out. How are you thinking about the depreciation piece of this as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the same as on Earth. So when you put an H100
well,
in
but on Earth you can like walk into the data center and update it and then leave, versus in space that's a little bit harder.
So let's say you put an H100 in a data center on Earth, and then 1 year later the Blackwell chip comes out. nobody's going and pulling the H100 out and putting the Blackwatch chicken in. So what they do is they keep the
Okay.
H100 running, if you see what I mean. And in space,
Yeah.
we're going to do the exact same thing. So
Mm-hmm.
the life of an H100 on Earth is about 5 years. Of course, in 5 years, it's not the latest chip, but in 5 years, it's still generating more cash than the electricity costs to put into it. And the same is, in fact, in space, we actually have slightly better economics because our marginal cost of energy after launch is zero. So there's an argument to be made that we'll actually use the chips longer in space than we will on Earth, if you see what I mean.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about your background and why you decided to start the company.
Yeah, for sure. So I spent the first 5 years of my career as an engineer on the software side, studied applied math and theoretical physics undergrad and masters, and then moved to the more sort of product commercial side. I was with McKinsey for a few years working with the space agencies of different governments, and then also founded and sold another business not related to this. Our CTO and chief engineer, Ezra Fielden, has a PhD in engineering from Imperial and then spent a decade designing and building satellites. Most recently, he was working on NASA's Lunar Pathfinder, and he was doing the deployables for that. So his specialty is all things large deployable structures in space. And then our third co-founder, Adi, who's our chief engineer, was previously at SpaceX as a principal software engineer, and he was the responsible engineer in charge of tracking beams, which is a feature that enables Starlink for other spacecraft, particularly for Starship and Falcon 9. And then before that, he was 20 years on the data center side with Microsoft, where he was one of the first to install large GPU clusters in collaboration with OpenAI and NVIDIA. And the reason we started, initially, I'd been seeing the launch costs coming down very rapidly during my work with McKinsey. And it sort of enabled many businesses that are not possible now, one of which is the idea of space-based solar. It's not a new concept. It's where you have very large solar panels in space and you somehow beam that power down. The problem with space-based solar is that you lose 90 or 95% of the energy and transmission from space to Earth. And so, yeah, if you have low-cost launch, and if most of the energy consumption of new energy projects on Earth is going into data centers, kind of follows that if you can find a cheap way to get the data center to space, you'd rather consume the energy close to the source. And so that became the basis of a white paper we put out a year and a half ago. It's on the front page of our website, starcloud.com/whitepaper, which lays out the calculations for building very large data centers in space. And yeah, to be honest, it's just an incredibly obvious thing to do once the launch cost hits a certain point. And so that's why we started getting going on it.
I've been asking you a lot of questions about all of the problems and challenges that are being discussed about this concept. What are the biggest challenges you see that you're facing right now?
Yeah, so the two biggest engineering challenges are, we've covered both of them, but number one is how do we dissipate the heat in a vacuum? And number two is how do you make the chips work in a high radiation environment? So about 70% of our engineering team is building this very large, low cost and low mass deployable radiator. We've got some very interesting or unusual manufacturing techniques to make that work. And then the other 30% of the team is working on making the chips work in a high radiation environment. And so that's all of the testing down in the particle accelerators and all that kind of thing.
Gotcha. Okay. So I know you've raised some money and are backed by NVIDIA, among others, Y Combinator. What does the trajectory look like over 2026? And when are you launching your next satellite?
Yeah, so we're launching the next one in October next year. That has about 100 times the power generation of the first, which will also have by far the largest commercial deployable radiator in space. And that'll be the first commercial offering. It will generate more cash than it costs to design, build, and launch. And actually, the initial market that we're going after is providing cloud and edge services for other satellites, particularly for US Department of War and Earth observation satellites. So right now they collect enormous amounts of both imagery, hyperspectral data, and synthetic aperture radar data. And they, at the moment, can't downlink all of that data because they have to wait for ground stations that have very low link from space to Earth. In future, they'll be able to use an optical terminal to transmit lots of data to us. We can then process it on the edge, and then we just downlink an insight from that. So the insight might be the location of a wildfire, or if they're searching for, let's say, a ship capsized and they want to know if there's a life raft somewhere out into the sea. Instead of having to downlink hundreds of terabytes of just images of the sea, they can just downlink the coordinates of where that life raft might be. So that's the first market, and it's obviously a much higher value market than competing with all data centers on energy, which we do need Starship for, which is not really a.
Got it. Okay. So have you had any discussions with the government about signing on?
Yes, yeah, we are working. We're doing paid workloads on the first spacecraft with various US DOW departments.
Okay. Gotcha.
Of which I cannot be too specific.
Sure. Okay. What is your really long-term moonshot vision for Starcloud? 20 years from now, you're a massive company. What does that look like?
Yeah, I think almost all compute will be in space, or at least almost all new compute will be being built in space within 20 years. Probably that looks like, maybe 50% of all total compute. And the reason is it just takes a long time to replace the stock on Earth. And I think that's an amazing thing for the planet. I mean, nobody wants a big data center next to them. Nobody wants a big new energy project next to them. The amount of water that data centers consume, particularly in the southern half of the US, is a huge problem. So my expectation is that within that time frame, we're going to see almost all new data centers being built in space.
Great. Philip Johnston, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.